Hello, we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so covering material that will serve as kind of an introduction to our discussion of the Gospels, which in the New Testament are the four stories, all that tell the life of Jesus. And one of the things that we're going to be discussing is ways in which they tell this story very similarly, but also ways in which they differ from one another. It is striking if you read all four uh, consecutively to notice that there are many similarities, but there are some very clear and distinct ways in which the four Gospels are different from one another. And so we're going to be looking in part at reasons for this. What are some of the reasons for the similarities and perhaps for the differences as well? All right, so the first issue that we're going to discuss in this video is readers of the Gospels and scholars very quickly notice something that is very clear. And this is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three of the four, are very, very similar to one another. And the Gospel of John is significantly different. Um, and so scholars and readers quickly began asking themselves, what could be the reason for this? Why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? In fact, often they will tell the same stories word for word, and sometimes they are almost identical to one another with just very small differences. And then John is very different. John tells some of the stories the same, but leaves out many stories about Jesus, adds new ones, and also Jesus acts differently. He speaks about himself in new and different ways in John compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so this question of what is going on with these three gospels? Why are they so similar? And that is often called the synoptic problem. Okay, so I've written out this word for you, synoptic, which means syn is the Greek or Latin word same, and optic or eye, vision, same eye or same perspective. So the idea here, these three gospels are called the synoptic gospels because they seem to be looking at the life of Jesus from one perspective. Even though they vary in small ways from each other, they are so similar that it seems as if one of the three is the original, and the other two are borrowing from or copying one. And so they have one perspective, one eye, one viewpoint. And so then the challenge is to figure out whose viewpoint are we looking at? Is Matthew the first gospel and Mark and Luke are copying from it, or perhaps Mark, or perhaps Luke? Um, and so this is this question that is sometimes called the synoptic problem. But the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they are so similar to one another. And then John is kind of off to the side, and we'll discuss it later because it's significantly different. It differs in quite a number of ways. Okay, and early in church history, Matthew, for a very long time, Matthew was considered to be the original gospel, and it was thought that Mark and Luke copied from Matthew. But for the last 200 years or more or so, that view has really fallen away. Now, almost all scholars would say that Mark seems to be the first gospel. And this is sometimes called Markan priority, or the idea that Mark came prior, Mark came first. And so, and we'll discuss in a moment when perhaps was Mark written and when were maybe Matthew and Luke written, and why might that matter as to when we think the Gospels were originally written. Um, but I'm going to show you a chart that I will hold up a few times here. And this is the idea that Mark is the first gospel, that Mark comes first, that Matthew and Luke borrow from Mark. And you'll notice that it's a very quick look at the three Gospels. You'll see that Mark is quite a bit shorter. It is significantly shorter than both Matthew and Luke. So one of the things that scholars notice is that over 90% of Mark shows up in Matthew, word for word. So in one sense, it is almost as if Matthew has taken almost the entire book of Mark and then just added on new material on top of that. In Luke, there's not quite as bit as much, but most of Mark also appears in Luke, also with material added on. So one of the things that I've done in this drawing, I've tried to make Matthew and Luke a little larger, kind of giving the sense that they are bigger books, longer books. Mark is shorter. And then I've drawn this circle with a Q in it. And there, in biblical scholarship, there's often this thing that is talked about, which is called the Q source. And Q comes from the German word quell, as noted here in the drawing. Q, quell equals source. So this idea was first thought of by German scholars. And so quell is a German word for source. And the idea being that there's this big chunk of Mark that appears in Matthew and Luke, but there's also quite a bit of material that is in Matthew and also in Luke, stories that Matthew and Luke share that are not in Mark. And so scholars question why do they have material that is similar to each other that Mark doesn't have at all? And so it seems as if Matthew and Luke must have had available to them some source that we don't have, that some mysterious source. And so this is called quell for just the source that's out there somewhere, or it's called Q. And this is any material that is in Matthew and Luke but is not in Mark. And so often, and then there's various diagrams, various ways to show this. But what I want to stress for you is this concept that Mark is sort of the foundation upon which Matthew and Luke build. That they come first. Excuse me for 1 second. That Mark comes first, probably about 20 years or so before Matthew and Luke are written, and then Matthew and Luke borrow from it. And so one of the questions is what leads scholars to think this? Why would they assume that Mark is first? And for a number of reasons. I'm going to give you 4 of sort of the basic reasons. We're not going to go into great detail about them. There are some additional ones. They get a little more complicated and difficult to describe. But for the sake of this course, if you are familiar with these 4 basic ideas, that'll be enough for the quiz this week. So the first basic thought is just simply that Mark is shorter. Why would, if Mark were not the first, why would Mark choose to leave out material that Matthew or Luke have? For example, both Matthew and Luke talk about the birth of Jesus. That seems like a very significant event. And yet Mark doesn't mention it at all. There's no conversation in Mark about Jesus being born. In Mark, Jesus just arrives on the scene as an adult. We don't know anything about his childhood. We don't know anything about his birth or where he is from. He just appears as an adult and begins doing things and teaching. So a basic question is, if you were putting together a life of Jesus, why would you subtract significant material? And that seems like material that you would want to have. What would be the advantage if you are Mark in taking Matthew and cutting stuff out that seems like, wow, that's information that a reader might want to know? Whereas in this case, it seems to make more sense that you would maybe start with a basic story, and then as you got more information, you might add to it. So one of the arguments for Mark being first is just that it's quite a bit shorter, and it leaves out a lot of significant information. A second, and the second and third here are very closely related. Um, Compared to Matthew and Luke, Mark has much more basic grammar and much more basic vocabulary than either Matthew and Luke have. And so, I mean, let me try to give you an example. This is just, I'm making this up. These are not the exact words of Mark or the exact words of Matthew. Often, if you were to read Mark, it is a bit like reading a paper written by somebody who is not very advanced as a writer. They repeat words over and over again. For example, if I were a grade school child and I'm writing a paper about describing my day, I might say, I had a very big breakfast, and then I went to school and I was in a very big hurry because I was late, and it was very hot today. And so I, wore my very favorite t shirt, and my very favorite teacher commented that, um, you know, I looked very good in it. I mean, what you'll notice is I'm repeating the word very over and over again and using it to describe all sorts of things. A more advanced writer would use different words to amplify or build upon or describe things. In writing, you don't want to use the same words over and over again. But Mark does that. Mark has a number of words that he uses constantly that just get used again and again and again. And one of the changes that Matthew and Luke do is they will tell the same stories uh, that Mark tells, but they will take out those repetitive words and add improvements, better words, better vocabulary, to kind of flesh out the writing. And so one question is, if Mark were not the first, why would Mark take a beautifully well crafted paragraph or story or description of an event in Jesus' life and take out the rich words and add simple, basic words instead? It seems much more likely that you would start with the primitive writing, the primitive vocabulary, and build on it to more advanced or better writing. And Matthew and Luke both represent improvements on Mark's grammar, improvements on Mark's vocabulary. And so it leads scholars to think, well, Mark probably comes first then. And then Matthew and Luke, when they change Mark, they make improvements to it. Um, a fourth point is that Matthew and Luke follows Mark's order of events. In Mark, and we're going to talk about this more in class. In Mark, Jesus is moving all the time. There's a lot of action in Mark. Mark does not spend very much time with Jesus standing around or sitting around talking. One of the things we'll see in Matthew and Luke is Jesus does quite a bit more of that. He tells stories. He has this big speech called the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks for quite a long time to a huge crowd of people. In Mark, Jesus is acting. He is going from place to place. He is doing things, often miracles. He is often healing sick people, um, performing miracles that help people in one way or another, and interacting with religious leaders and other people that he comes into contact with. In Matthew and Luke, so Mark has this very clear series of events, just one after another, and action. And Jesus moves from one place to the next and is constantly doing stuff. Matthew and Luke will follow that same order of events. Every once in a while, it's like they'll hit pause on the video camera. They'll hit pause, and Jesus will go tell a story, or Jesus will go preach for a while. But when they're done telling that story, they come right back to the same place in Mark's order of events and start talking again. And so it seems as if both Matthew and Luke kind of have the timeline of Mark's story as their basic structure. and they pause every once in a while and go tell a new story. They add something that Jesus did. But when they're finished with that, they come right back to the same place in the order of events that Mark was at, and then they kind of take up and continue on from there. So that's a fourth reason that people seem to think Mark is probably the first. One last one, which is a little more difficult to describe, is there are clues, or scholars believe that there are clues, often not concrete statements, that seem to refer to events in Jewish history or events in Jesus lived. Particularly, there's a very big event in 70 A.D. So a number of decades after Jesus has been crucified and risen from the dead. In 70 A.D., the Roman Empire destroys Jerusalem, and that is a huge event in the history of the Jewish faith. And there seem to be clues in Matthew and Luke that the writer is writing after that event has already happened, whereas Mark doesn't have those clues. And so that seems to be a hint that perhaps Mark is written before the fall of Jerusalem, and that Matthew and Luke come after. Now there are no concrete overt statements to that effect. So it's scholars trying to kind of read in between the lines a little bit and to what's going on in Matthew and Luke. But there seem to be suggestions that they are writing after this disastrous event, whereas Mark is writing before. All right, so those are a number of the reasons that scholars seem to think that Mark comes first. Now, what I want to turn to next is the handout that I gave you called the Gospel Comparison. Okay, so if you will look at that as we discuss it here for a few minutes, what you see is two passages, one from Mark 6, and the second from Matthew 13 and into chapter 14. And what I've tried to do in laying these two side by side is to do two things. One, to show how very, very similar these passages are. Okay, so if you'll walk through the handout with me, the first few segments I've just summarized and not given word for word, and then the last segment we do have word for word, and we'll spend a moment discussing that. Okay, so Mark 6 begins with Jesus makes some comments about a prophet without honor. Matthew 13, Jesus makes some statements about a prophet without honor. In Mark 6, John the Baptist is beheaded. In Matthew 13, John the Baptist is beheaded. In Mark 6, immediately after that, Jesus feeds 5,000 people on a hillside. In Matthew 13, Jesus also feeds 5,000 people. And then begins, so it seems as if we're looking at the same day in Jesus' life, or at least the same structured series of events. Matthew and Mark are kind of moving at the same, from one event to the next, discussing the same things. So here's how Mark describes the story that comes next. This is often called Jesus walking on the water. Okay, so immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. So that starts the story. Matthew says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So very similar, some tiny differences, but not significant. Mark continues, after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Matthew says, after he dismissed them, very similar, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. So again, almost word for word, tiny differences. Back to Mark. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. Matthew. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was a considerable distance from the land. So a tiny change. Matthew has added some details that Mark doesn't have. Back to Mark. Jesus saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. In Matthew, The boat was a considerable distance from the land, as we said, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Mark, shortly before dawn, he went out to them. Jesus went out to them. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And Mark as well says walking on the lake. Um, okay, so Mark says shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. They thought he was a ghost. Matthew says shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Mark says they cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. So basically, Jesus' closest friends, the disciples, are in a boat and they without their friend Jesus. And they look up and Jesus is walking out towards them on top of the water. So imagine, like he's surfing or something, only he's walking. He is just walking on the water towards them, and they're terrified. They've never seen a human do this. They think it's a ghost, and so in both stories, Jesus's friends are confused and they think they've seen a ghost. Um, in Mark, we have this. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them, said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." In Matthew, Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." So it seems as if this is the exact same event, right? Jesus is walking on water. He's doing it right after the feeding of the 5,000. He has said the same things in both stories. But now, if you look at the handout, on the Mark side, there's a big blank space, right? And on the Matthew side, we have this. Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Okay, so that's a very interesting story, right? Peter, who is one of Jesus's close friends, doesn't stay in the boat. All of the other friends do, but Peter says, "Jesus, if that's really you, let me come out with you and walk on the water." And he does. And so he briefly gets out, and for a brief period of time, we're not told exactly how long, but Peter also miraculously walks on water. He doesn't sink. But, however, he starts to look around and it's windy and there's big waves and it's kind of a storm and he gets scared and he does begin to sink. But for a very brief period of time, Jesus is not the only one walking on the water. Peter is walking on the water with him. That seems like a fascinating story. That seems like a story that, if you were aware of it, you would want to have in your Bible, in your account. But Mark doesn't, right? Mark doesn't tell that story at all. Matthew does. But then notice what happens. As soon as Matthew is done telling that story, he goes right back to Mark's. Then in Mark it says, "Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down." Matthew says, "When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down." So Mark has left out Peter completely, either because he doesn't know that story or for some reason he doesn't think it fits what he's trying to do. But now Jesus has climbed into the boat and the storm has stopped, right? And so we're almost to the end, and something interesting is about to happen. So far, other than Peter, the episode of Peter walking on the water, these two stories are pretty much identical. But now they end differently, which is also interesting. When in Mark, it says they were completely amazed, they being Jesus' friends, the disciples. They were completely amazed, for they did not understand about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Right? That's a strange statement. They did not understand about the loaves. What loaves are we talking about? Probably the feeding of the 5,000. In that story, Jesus has taken bread and taken a little bit of bread and prayed over it, and then now it feeds thousands of people. And he's performed a miracle. And it seems as if the writer is saying, somehow they did not learn the lesson of that miracle, so they're also confused about this one. But at the end of the story, Jesus' friends are confused and they don't understand, and their hearts are hardened. In Matthew, this is what happens. Jesus climbs in the boat, the wind dies down, then those who were in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." That's the opposite response to Mark, right? In Mark, the people in the boat are scared and confused, and they have hard hearts. Remember back in the Old Testament, Pharaoh had a hard heart. He did not get what God was doing. But in this case, in Matthew's version, the disciples totally understand. In fact, they worship Jesus and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God," right? So, which one is correct? Okay, so one of the challenges often for American Christians reading this story is, okay, if the Bible is true, and there's only one correct answer to history, what really happened, um, this is a problem, right? Because it seems as if these two writers are in disagreement. That one says the disciples didn't understand and were confused. The other says they did and they worship Jesus. And so are these two stories in conflict with one another? And they might be. I mean, that's one possibility. Um, Another possibility that some suggest is there's at least 12 of these friends in the boat. And so perhaps some of them are confused and don't understand. And perhaps some of them worship and do understand. And Matthew tells the story of those that do understand and do worship. Mark tells the story of those that don't and that are confused and afraid. But what is interesting is neither one of the disciples say that. Like neither one says, "Oh, they had a bunch of different responses, but I really want to emphasize this particular one." They just say this is what all of them did, right? Which kind of leads to this question: what are the writers doing? Okay, so one of the things that is very important to think about is that the writers of the Gospels are not just, it's not like they're walking around with their phones, recording everything that they see and then writing it down at the end of the day. They do not seem to be merely recording or reporting events. They are also interpreting them, right? And that is a difference. Okay, it is one thing if if you ask me, uh, on the way to class, there's a traffic accident outside on the edge of campus, and you walk into class and say, "Steve, did you see the accident? What happened?" Right? And I might say, "Yes, I did. Yeah, here I saw this blue car ran into the red car, and the blue car was going north, the red car was going south very quickly, and this is how the accident happened." And that would be reporting the event. Okay. Now, if I were to say, the driver of the blue car was clearly not paying attention. In fact, I think they were probably drunk. They looked as if they were inebriated to me, and I feel pretty confident that they were um, driving under the influence of alcohol or some drug, and they clearly were ignoring the traffic signs and stoplights, and they were completely at fault, and they ran into the red car, and the red car was blameless. Like, I have now interpreted the events that I've seen. I've not only said what happened, but I have given meaning, motive. Here is I have added my sense of what here are the events that happened, and here's what they meant. Okay? And one of the things that it's important to do as we read the Gospels is try to notice the ways in which the writers are telling us events from Jesus' life, but they're also adding their opinions about what they think those events mean. Um, why did this happen? What did Jesus mean by this, or in what way was this important? So that as we discuss the Gospels in class, the next several sessions, that's one of the things we'll be asking. Okay, so now I want to turn to a passage in Luke, which is the third gospel listed, which gives us some comments about how Luke went about writing his gospel, and very likely how the others did as well. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and then we'll go back and highlight several features of it. Okay, so this is from Luke 1, and Luke says this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Okay, let me kind of go over that again really quickly, and then we'll break it down a little bit. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things they have seen, just as they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses. With this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and I have decided to write down an account for you. Okay, so Luke has told us of three significant things right there. First, he has said, others have written, right? We know that at least three others eventually do: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Perhaps there are more. We don't know. But Luke is telling us that he is aware of other written accounts. Like, other people are writing down the life of Jesus. Okay, so none of the gospel writers, with the exception maybe of Mark, if he truly is first, are writing in a vacuum. They're not completely alone. Other people are doing the same thing. And Luke has told us that. Others have written. Many have undertaken to draw up an account. And then he goes on to say, what are they writing? The things that were handed down to us by those that were first eyewitnesses. Okay? So he is saying people are writing down the story of Jesus. And there might be any number of reasons why they're choosing to write stuff down at this point, but they're writing down the life of Jesus, and they're using information handed down by eyewitnesses. Okay? Which suggests a couple things. One being that Luke probably is not an eyewitness, right? He, in saying that myself and others are interviewing eyewitnesses. We are taking accounts of people who were with Jesus, who maybe are now getting old and perhaps beginning to die, and we want to write this down before they do. But he's kind of suggesting that he is not an eyewitness. And many scholars think that perhaps none of these four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, were actual eyewitnesses, but are drawing from other accounts. And then later on, we'll talk about some possibilities. For example, Luke is going to begin his story with quite a bit of information about Mary, Jesus' mother. And so one of the possibilities is that maybe Mary is one of these eyewitnesses that Luke interviews, right? So the third statement he makes, I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. So the image that I would like to leave you with, like sometimes, I when I was young and thought about how the people that wrote the Bible, I probably had this idea in my head that they were like sitting in a room one night, and then all of a sudden they went into a trance, and like some spirit kind of came upon them, and their hand just kind of picked up a pen or a quill probably in this time, and they just started writing, and their minds are not even thinking, right? Like God, the Holy Spirit, has somehow taken over their hand, and they just are writing on a paper, and they don't even know the words that they're writing down, because God is inspiring these words. They're God's words, and there's the physical hand is being used. That's not what Luke is talking about, right? Luke is talking about, I have read other accounts. Other people have written down the life of Jesus, and I've read those. I've interviewed eyewitnesses. I've investigated what those eyewitnesses said. Like maybe I've gone to the towns and I've looked for people. Were you there? Did you see this miracle? What happened? Can you tell me what happened? And then now I'm writing it down. So to me, the image, and I think as a college student, this is a apropos metaphor. The picture is not just somebody's head being kind of ripped open by God and these words just pouring in, but more somebody sitting at a desk writing a research paper. They have notes from interviews. They have maybe other accounts. Maybe Luke is sitting there with Mark's account and he's copying quite a bit of it. They have, index cards perhaps, gathered around them on the desk, and they're doing a research paper and they're kind of pulling it together. And that to me seems a more accurate picture of how the Gospels come about and are written than sort of this magical in a trance idea that I had maybe when I was young as a kid. Now that doesn't mean that God couldn't still be using this process and kind of inspiring the work that Luke is doing, but Luke is using his own mind. Luke is working hard to accurately research this information and put it down. And so we're going to talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke for several class periods, and ways in which continue to talk about ways in which they're similar and different, and what might some of their goals be. Because as they interpret the life of Jesus, they're not going to interpret it exactly the same, and that's one of the things we'll look at. We'll also have some discussions about the dating of when these books probably were written, and we'll go into that. And then finally, we will turn to John, which is a very fascinating but very different gospel than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we'll end our time with the Gospels after a few classes with some discussion of John. All right, so all you need to do with this video is turn in notes on next Monday's class that you watch this video, and you will be responsible for information from the video on this Thursday's quiz. All right, thank you very much.